brought my report with me.
Good morning.
I can follow along.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members. My name's Brian Annis. I've recently been appointed by Governor Newsom as the Chief Financial Officer at High Speed Rail, but pending my start date there, I come to you today as the Secretary of Transportation. I'm also joined on my left here by Russell Fong, who's the current CFO at High Speed Rail, and he's moving over to be CFO at the Department of Housing and Community Development to help lead their expansion in housing activities that they're going to do over there. The 2019 project update report was released on May 1st and reconfirms Governor Newsom's approach to high-speed rail, a version he first laid out in the State of the State in February. That vision gets high-speed trains on the ground in the Central Valley as soon as possible, lives within our fiscal means, and remains committed to the vision of high-speed rail connecting the Bay Area and Southern California. The project update report addresses statutorily required reporting elements such as updates on cost, accomplishments, and risks. Additionally, this year's project update report includes information the authority committed to provide at the time of last year's business plan. First, the 2018 business plan had indicated a funding gap for the valley-to-valley segment that was the cost of tunneling in Pacheco Pass from Gilroy to Madera. The authority indicated the 2019 project update report would include an analysis of early high-speed service in the Central Valley and separately in the Gilroy to San Francisco segment. That analysis indicates the best segment for early interim service is the Merced to Bakersfield segment. That segment would decrease trip times by 90 to 100 minutes and about double rail ridership across the ACE, San Joaquin, and new high-speed rail service. Second, the early train operator reviewed the capital cost estimates and performed a benchmarking exercise focused on cost categories that are not location dependent, such as tunnels, viaducts, and bridges, and compared that to cost experience in Germany, which is where the ETO is from. That analysis suggested some opportunities for cost savings, which will be further explored during preliminary engineering and final design phases. Lastly, the authority completed a more rigorous risk evaluation and made updates to Central Valley cost estimates. These estimates increased the contingency from about $500 million to about $1.5 billion and included some scope increases, $362 million, and cost increases, $477 million. These include items such as intrusion barriers, legal settlements, and tracks and systems. This project update report focuses the existing funding resources the state has identified to get a section of high-speed rail up and running that can demonstrate the viability of the broader project. Specifically, the report proposes building the Merced-Fresno-Bakersfield line, a building block project that matches the available funding we have based on the best information we have today. At the same time, the project update report maintains existing commitments to bookend projects and completion of environmental documents on the entire San Francisco to Anaheim section. When these initial investments are complete, the state will have a very substantial investment in upgrading rail in the state. Caltrain electrification in the Bay Area on a 50-mile segment, initially used by Caltrain, but later shared with high-speed rail. This investment increases speeds, capacity, and improves air quality. Central Valley high-speed rail, early interim service on 171 miles, linking the major southern San Joaquin cities of Merced, Fresno, and Bakersfield, getting high-speed trains operating in California, and achieving substantial mobility, economic, and air quality benefits. Los Angeles Union Station, run-through tracks, and Rosecrans-Marquardt grade separation, increasing speeds and capacity through Los Angeles, initially benefiting Metrolink and Surfline or Amtrak, but later shared with high-speed rail. So Governor Newsom remains supportive of the valley-to-valley vision of high-speed rail and believes the Central Valley building block is a tangible first step to realizing that vision. To make the full San Francisco to LA Anaheim system a reality, we first needed to build a working segment to demonstrate high-speed rail to Californians. This project update report also fully embraces the auditor's findings from the November 2018 audit, including significant transparency, oversight, and management reforms. The administration has already made the project more transparent and accountable by posting change orders on the high-speed rail website. Additionally, this project update report includes a thorough discussion of risk, including risk related to the federal government. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Can you go into a little bit more detail about how what the parameters were that were used for the early operator options?
Sure. Well, this was based off the call in the 28 business plan to look at the valley-to-valley segment, realizing the current funding wasn't sufficient to fully build valley-to-valley with that gap in the middle of the tunnels through Pacheco. So the ETO focused both on the San Francisco to Gilroy segment and the Central Valley segment, and looked at what the benefits would be of having a high-speed operation on those segments. And of course, in the Bay Area, you have the Caltrain service that would be running on those same alignments, and in the Central Valley, sort of recognizing the ACE and the San Joaquin service.
LAO, did you want to make some comments? Please.
Sure. Helen Kirstein with the Legislative Analyst's Office. We have identified 6 major issues for legislative consideration preliminarily, so I'll briefly summarize those for you if that's acceptable.
Yes.
So as was indicated by the authority, this project update report refocuses the project, and it refocuses it on a segment between Merced and Bakersfield. This is based in part by this analysis that was conducted by the early train operator. We would note, however, that that analysis is highly dependent on some of the assumptions that the early train operator made in terms of how this service would integrate with existing other services, including ACE and Amtrak, as well as some capital projects that would need to occur. For example, having a shared station at Merced, which is not currently envisioned. So certainly, should these assumptions not materialize, that could affect both the ridership and the revenue projections that are assumed. The second issue we wanted to flag is that we believe the actual cost of the project could potentially be higher than our estimated. Part of this is just intrinsic to any large mega project, which is, of course, subject to substantial uncertainty. This project also has some unique risks, including regarding scheduling, which could increase costs. Furthermore, we just wanted to also highlight an aspect of the authority's assumptions for how it has come to its estimates. So it's indicated that in the 2018 plan, it set the baseline budget such that there's a 10% chance that basically the project will come in at or below that baseline budget. It's now revised that approach to basically assume a 70% chance that the project will come in at or below that cost estimate, but only from Merced to Bakersfield. So they haven't re-looked at the entire project cost, and we believe that if you did that for the entire project, you'd probably end up with a higher cost estimate than is reflected for the entire project.
How could you do that if you don't know? I mean, at this point, the route hasn't been determined. So
they do have some preliminary. Yeah, that's a very good question. They have some cost estimates that they've put together for Phase 1 in previous business plans. For example, the 2018 business plan identified about $77 billion of a total cost. That was assuming a route that would, the route that's sort of been discussed. Certainly, they're refining the specifics of it, but I think the general route has been, laid out such that they felt comfortable that they could identify that project cost. Certainly, there's more. There's a greater range of potential costs for those aspects that haven't been precisely nailed down. So those segments that they haven't figured out exactly the corridor are subject to more uncertainty, but they were still able to provide a range and a point estimate. But the point estimate, I think our point is the point estimate was set using a less conservative methodology than they're using now for Merced to Bakersfield. And if they applied that more conservative methodology to the entire cost estimate, we believe that the cost estimate would be higher than now. What they're saying is $79 billion because there's a roughly $2 billion cost increase.
That 70% estimate above or below is kind of interesting because it's such a large number. It could be 70% higher or 70% lower, or is 70% chance that it could be higher or lower, or is that skewed in one direction or the other? It seems like it would be.
Yeah, so my understanding is that the way they did it before, they basically did a simulation, a modeling exercise to look at sort of what are the chances that the cost estimates would fall in at different levels, basically. And previously, they took that sort of, I don't know, distribution. It's a little bit of a technical kind of exercise, and they basically set the point estimate, assuming that essentially there was only a 10% chance they would stay within that budget. So that's pretty low. I mean, there's a 90% chance you're going to go over budget, right? And that's not a very conservative estimate. So they've indicated that now, based on best practices, they're revising that assumption, and now they're taking a much more conservative approach and taking a 70%. So now they're assuming a contingency such that there's a 70% chance they'll stay at or below that cost estimate. That seems very reasonable to us.
Oh, I misheard that.
Yeah.
So it's at or below?
At or below. So now they're doing 70% at or below that cost estimate. I may have not made that clear. I apologize. But that does seem like a much preferable kind of assumption. It's certainly more conservative than the 10% approach. But we would note that they only applied that methodology to Merced to Bakersfield, not to the entire project. So if you had applied that methodology to the entire project, you would likely have a higher cost estimate.
Would I be correct in assuming that's because there is a lot, as we sit here now, and we're talking about a project that, as it moves forward into those other areas, is far less predictable for us as we're sitting here now. So the ability to kind of use that more conservative number applies here, but it would be difficult to apply it to the longer term.
Yeah, they do have a rationale within the business plan. I think it's along those lines, and they could probably speak to that in more detail. However, I think we would argue that actually you might want to, I think, have that conservative approach for those very uncertain areas as well, because yes, you're going to have a larger range in terms of your possible costs, but in terms of setting your point estimate for budgeting purposes, we still believe that it makes sense to set that such that there's a relatively small chance you'll go over that budget, because we don't want to. We want to make sure we're realistic in setting that budget, so that the legislature really has a sense of what it's committing to.
So I think I interrupted your flow, so I apologize for that. But
yes.
Before you move on, when LAO is completed her remarks, Mr. Annis, maybe you can respond to that particular issue of whether or not we can apply a more conservative approach to cost estimates for the future segments.
So, I apologize. So the third major issue that we wanted to flag for folks is that we believe it's unclear whether there'll be sufficient funding to complete the Merced to Bakersfield segment. And partly that's because of this cost uncertainty. Certainly costs could be higher. It's also because there's some uncertainty on the revenue side as well. As was mentioned, there's $3.5 billion in federal funds. I believe the committee is aware of this, that the project has received. However, the federal government has threatened to rescind these dollars, and should that occur, that would make it much more difficult for the project to be fully funded. Additionally, there's always some uncertainty with cap and trade revenues, as the committee is aware, and so we think that the assumptions on the cap and trade revenues are reasonable, but subject to some uncertainty. So we wanted to flag that for folks as well. Certainly, to the extent that those funds don't materialize or costs are higher, the general fund or other funding sources could be required. Fourth, we wanted to flag that there's no funding plan beyond Merced to Bakersfield at this point. So to the extent that the legislature wanted to go beyond that segment and wanted to extend and do all of Valley to Valley or do all of Phase 1, additional funds would be required, likely from the general fund, at least in whole or in part. Fifth, we did want to also highlight that the legislature has various options for moving forward. So we continue to think this is a good opportunity for the legislature to assess what its priorities are and how it wants to approach the project. This is a little bit of a shift in approach for the authority, and also just given this funding gap and given sort of all of the different considerations facing the legislature, we think this is a good chance to sort of step back and think about what the legislature wants to do in terms of its priorities for this project. As I said, this is certainly one option, but there are other options available. The legislature could commit, for example, to a shorter segment, just doing, for example, the initial construction segment, could do a longer segment. It could focus on high-speed service, as is proposed in this project update report, or it could have some kind of either interim or longer-term service that would be less high-speed, potentially, or could even use conventional diesel service. So there are a variety of options that are available to the legislature. We think that they should all be considered, and certainly the legislature should evaluate them. And then finally, we do lay out some potential considerations as the legislature evaluates those options. I'll just very briefly summarize them. One is cost. So the initial construction segment is now estimated to cost $12.4 billion. That's up by $1.8 billion from previous estimates. The extensions to Merced and Bakersfield in total are estimated to cost about $4 billion more. The second consideration is transportation benefits. So we believe the legislature is going to want to weigh the transportation benefits, the accessibility and mobility benefits associated with the different options against their costs. So, for example, those extensions, do those provide $4 billion worth of benefit? And that's going to be the choice facing the legislature. Also, we recommend considering effects on local communities, both in terms of construction impacts and disruptions, as well as economic benefits that can be provided. And then also highlight that there are the legislature is going to want to consider any risks and uncertainties associated with the options. The agenda does a really nice job of outlining a number of those. Those could involve cost increases, coordination with other entities. We've briefly touched on those, as well as potential issues related to compliance with Proposition 1A requirements and requirements for federal funds. So happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Mr. Annis, do you want to take a crack at answering that earlier question?
Sure.
And then we'll open it up to questions from the dais.
And that was a good description of the change in probabilities and risk and so forth. And generally, the project update report does not include a reevaluation of all project costs. That typically is the business plans that are done in the even number years. So the High-Speed Rail Authority will be working on updated estimates for the 2020 business plan, and certainly bring some of these lessons learned from the Central Valley into that re-estimation of the broader Phase 1 cost.
All right, thank you. Mr. Patterson, I know you had your hand up, followed by Ms. Rivas. And Mr. Fong.
Thank you. Let me start with page 15. For the first time, it is now apparent in your own plan that the high-speed rail will require millions of dollars of subsidy. And that's on page 15. I want to read to you Streets and Highways Code Section 2704.08. The authority cannot spend, this is a summary, that cannot spend bond funds until it obtains a certification from an independent firm that the service will not require a subsidy. The language is prior to commitment by proceeds of the bond, and there's several. The authority shall have provided, and it goes on to specifically outline precisely what has to be concluded. Reports prepared by independent financial firms, etc. And I draw your attention to the section subheaded D, and I'm quoting, "The planned passenger train service to be provided by the authority or pursuant to its authority will not require operating subsidy." Have you not just disqualified yourself from Prop 1A funds?
No, sir. We've looked at Prop 1A and the requirements around that. And in the Central Valley, when we've been working on the 119-mile segment since 2012, that has, with the federal grant, always envisioned this idea of interim service or interim use of that facility. So there's been plans with the federal government on running trains on that segment if there's any gap between, having that segment built out and longer high-speed rail service. So we've looked at that service with the idea that other operators would be using the facility in the interim before you have that longer high-speed rail segment that would be operated directly by high-speed rail, consistent with that requirement. Legally, it's similar to the Caltrain example in the Bay Area. There with the bookend funds, about $600 million of Prop 1A funds have gone or are going to that segment of Caltrain electrification that would be used initially by Caltrain. Caltrain receives operating subsidies to run that service. Later on, high-speed rail will be on that segment as well as a shared segment. There was, I mentioned additionally, there was a bill by Assemblymember Mullen, AB 1889, that clarified some of those provisions around investment of high-speed rail funds that serve other passenger rail operators, and there are investments that are useful for high-speed rail when high-speed rail eventually gets to those segments. But in the interim, it's appropriate with bond proceeds to have those early investments in the corridor.
Again, I'm specifically referring to operational subsidy and the express language in the bond. What you are suggesting is that you will essentially offload to Amtrak, for example, in Central California, and therefore Amtrak will have to absorb the subsidy. But the language is very clear that the service provided by the authority or pursuant to your authority, to hand that off to another agency that is going to require taxpayer and California government subsidy, will not require operating subsidy. To me, that language is very clear, and I think that this, I think, puts at risk, and I think you've already discovered that there is substantial now new information that fuels the ongoing litigation and lawsuit over the Prop 1A funds. What I suggest is you're going to have a very, very hard time offloading that to Amtrak or some other operator, because it's still pursuant to your authority. You are creating a system initially operated with a subsidy, which I think is expressly forbidden. But it is clear you have a different view on that, and my guess is that this will again feed litigation. I want to talk about. I was really stunned when I watched an NBC Bay Area investigative journalism report, and I want to quote Joe Hedges, the chief operating officer. NBC Bay Area story on April 29th. It says, "I can't speak for yesterday, I can only speak for today and tomorrow, and that is exactly what we're doing." The reporter asks, "What are you going to be doing in December 2020? Mr. Hedges says, "We're going to see infrastructure complete with plain rail on top of that." The NBC reporter followed that up, and then Mr. Hedges clarified it. What we call plain rail, simple rail, that is basically capable of running a train on it. The follow-up question from NBC, not a high-speed train? Quote, no, probably not. End of quote. On top of billions of dollars worth of high-speed concrete, you plan to put slow-speed rail. And you're calling that an initial operating segment?
No, that quote from the chief operating officer was misinterpreted. So what is required by the federal grant is to lay down the track work, and that was what is being referred to. So by 2022, end of 2022, it's a requirement to lay down the track. Later, the project was expanded when we did the funding plan in late 2016, early 2017 for the 1A bonds to include electrification. of that 119-mile segment. So that's the distinction, I believe, that was being referred to. You have by 2022 putting down the track, but that track is fully suitable for high-speed trains. That track won't change. What will be added then as part of the later phase is the electrification of that.
Without the electrification, it doesn't work for high-speed rail, true or not?
Well, and that's why it's part of the cost. It's part of the Merced to Bakersfield is the electrification.
Again, the concern I am raising here is Central California has been the guinea pig in all of this, and we have had thousands of acres of prime ag torn up. We have lots of our streets and roads torn up. We have these concrete monuments to high-speed rail, and yet by this admittance, by the plan in front of us, you're going to put plain rail up there, and you're going to run slow speed for, what, a decade or more? Something like that?
No, what's in the project update report is to build a high-speed rail capable system, and the project update report indicates that you'd have service running from Merced to Bakersfield, high-speed service, by the end of 2027, and in the extension to Merced by the end of 2028.
Again, that is predicated upon your ability to get the necessary funds, including substantial amounts of funds from the federal government. I want to draw your attention again to the NBC Bay Area May 3rd story. And these are quotes directly out of the story. This is some very good investigative journalism, and I might suggest that we basically get accuracy from the media and from our auditor. We rarely get accuracy from this authority. At the present rate of construction, high-speed rail cannot make the federal deadline. These are the conclusions of the story. High-speed rail needs to be spending $149 million a month to reach the target deadline. And they say, as of May 3rd, you only hit that target once. And that high-speed rail is constructing 3 times slower than the necessary pace. And what I found interesting was in this story, according to 3 HSR officials who did not want to be quoted for fear of retribution, that they'll miss and that the deadline by years. So I think not only I think you're risking the Prop 1A, but I think you're risking the federal money. And I think given the manner in which this plan is varied almost annually or biannually, I think you're running into very serious credibility problems with the federal government, because I think that anybody that looks at what is before us has to have real grave reservations that you're going to meet these kind of deadlines. When we look backwards, you've never met deadlines of cost before. Never met deadlines of completion before. Why should we have confidence that you can meet deadline completions that if you don't meet them, will put at risk billions of federal dollars?
Well, the schedule of 2022 is a challenging schedule, but the project on the ground and some of the risk and the information the project update report show how we're addressing those issues. It's much more granular as the project goes further along. There's in your agenda, for example, there's some additional information on right-of-way acquisition and things like that. So you see the number shrinking. Right-of-way is nearing completion. The structures, you look at them one by one. There's a lot of grade separations. There's grading work between those grade separations. So again, the project's advancing with the work being done with new team coming in, the COO, others really looking at much more granular issues with each section, each structure, addressing those, and again, getting those to construction, as you say, is key, and that's how we think over the next period rebuild that credibility, is showing those structures getting under construction, showing those structures getting completed.
You are presently, I understand, under federal audit by the Inspector General. Much of this concern was raised with the California State Auditor. And in the California State Auditor's conclusions and report, it was suggested that High Speed Rail Authority is at grave risk of clawback. This had to do with the early spending, letting out contracts when the authority knew precisely they did not have the property upon which to do the construction, lots of delays, and the auditor concluded those were the fundamental reasons for the early delays. You are under audit. Have you had requests for documentation? Are you being forthright and transparent with this audit? I notice in your report that you are suggesting that there is radio silence at the federal government. Does that not indicate to you that there is a serious ongoing effort here to take a look at high-speed rail and determine whether or not billions of dollars should be clawed back because of the past performance and the likelihood that the future performance is going to miss the federal deadline? Are you aware of the audit, and are you participating in document requests or information?
Yeah. So we are aware, Russ Vaughn, the outgoing Chief Financial Officer, we are aware that the FRA is actually being audited from their side, and part of that audit is looking at high-speed rail invoices. To answer your question about performance, what I can say is we are hitting a tough stretch right now, and our performance is below what our expectations are. When we went to the board back in June to ask for our budget of $1.8 billion for this fiscal year, we did highlight that it was a very aggressive budget and a very aggressive schedule. With that being said, what I can assure you is that we do report to the board, Finance and Audit Committee, every month on our progress, and that those numbers are actually probably come from our board reports of our progress. So we are monitoring our progress on a monthly basis. We do have a plan in place that we believe will get us back on track, but it is an aggressive schedule.
Yeah. One final, Mr. Chairman, about contingency plan or Plan B. Since I've been in the legislature and since I've been on this committee, I've asked repeatedly, what is your Plan B? It is apparent that the plan envisioned is no longer the plan. And in fact, I've suggested that the manner in which you scaled down, chopped up, changed, moved around this entire operation is that it's not, this isn't a business plan, this is essentially a going out of business plan. It demonstrates the unraveling, in my judgment, because of the risk factors and previous history. And so I want to refer to the auditor, California State Auditor, to ensure that it is adequately prepared if it is unable to meet the federal grant deadline of December 2022. The authority should, by May 2019, develop a contingency plan for responding to such a scenario. This was the authority's response. The authority concurs with this recommendation. I go down to the bottom applicable paragraph, and we will prepare a contingency plan in accordance with the CSA recommendation. Plan completion date May 2019. I see no Plan B in this report. What on earth is your contingency plan? You have ripped up Central California. We have thousands of acres of prime ag land that is no longer in use. On top of billions of dollars worth of high-speed contract, you, by your own admission, are laying down plain rail. And the result of this is that Central California is experiencing a real letdown and a huge disappointment in what was promised and what is performed. And what we see is this plan essentially establishes what amounts to a slow-speed rump railroad between Bakersfield and Madera, and I think it's questionable whether you have the money to get it to Merced. So what on earth? Doesn't in the middle of the night you wake up saying, oh my God, this thing has real problems. What are we going to do if everybody that does any kind of large-scale projects like this have contingency plans? Where is your plan B? You were asked by the auditor to provide one. The authority committed to providing it May of this year. Here we have lots of pages, color, pretty, lots of language. What's missing? One of the most important elements of the audit that you committed to produce.
Well, if I could answer that a couple ways. First, the timeline for that is the 6-month audit reply, which is coming up in a few weeks.
Yeah.
I would mention, as far, again, on respectfully disagreeing with you on what is proposed for the Central Valley. Again, what's proposed for the Central Valley is electrified high-speed rail. The Merced to Bakersfield segment as an electrified segment. If less is ultimately built out, there are certainly, even in the grant agreement, there's contingencies for cutover rail to Amtrak and things like that. But what is proposed here, because I think it's very consistent with Prop 1A, is to build high-speed rail. And so what we're proposing is what we believe is the optimal use of the funds we have available to complete the best high-speed rail segment that can be achieved with the funding available. And again, believe that's a high-quality, high-speed rail line of 171 miles. So we stand beside.
So you are essentially saying that Joe Hedges and his comments on the public record in an investigative story that says you're putting plain rail up there, and no, it probably will not be high speed.
No, sir.
Who's telling us the truth?
What is being built is high-speed rail. Again, it gets to the phasing. The 2022 timeline doesn't require the electrification, the catenaries be built on that schedule. But those are part of the funding plan, and that is what is proposed, is to build electrified high-speed rail.
Are you planning to buy any high-speed equipment, or does that wait until someday, maybe a decade from now, you have the money to make plain rail high-speed? Sure. What's going to run on this thing when you open it up and call it an initial operating segment? Isn't it supposed to demonstrate the advantages of high-speed rail? And when you put plain track on it, and there's a 8, 9, 10-year window where we're not even sure that you electrify in that period of time.
Mr. Patterson.
And if you miss the deadline, you have fund issues.
We've got a queue. You're asking questions that have already been answered, but if you want to provide a response.
Well, with due respect, Mr. Chairman, I don't think the answers have been accurate.
Sure. And to answer
right.
that final question, the plan does include funding for high-speed rail trains and a maintenance facility for those trains.
Ms. Rivas.
Can you please explain again exactly how this project update came up with total funding available of, what, $20.4 billion?
Yeah. So consistent with our 2016 business plan and 2018 business plan, we had ranges of what funding can come in, mainly due to the fluctuation of cap and trade every year. So in this project update report, we really focused on 2 scenarios. We have a low scenario, which is about $20.4 billion. And that basically scenario is saying that cap and trade will come in at about $500 million a year. We have a high scenario that assumes that cap and trade will come in at $750 million a year, which brings that up to $23.45 billion. Anywhere within that range, we feel comfortable that the project will be funded, the Merced to Bakersfield. But again, it depends on what cap and trade comes in. We do monitor that on a quarterly basis. I can tell you as of today, our actual dollars, we're actually coming in higher than what our highest projections are. We should be at about $9.74 billion, and that's exactly where we're at today. So cap and trade is actually coming in a little bit higher than our highest estimate. However, we can't guarantee that, and we do monitor that quarterly every time an auction comes in.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. And can you please walk me through how you determined the anticipated amount of funding that you expect to be available to complete the interim segment?
Sure. So right now we have about $3.5 billion in federal funds that we're very aware of. We have the Prop 1A, $9 billion. We still have about $4.2 billion that we don't have access to of that $9 billion. And then the rest is cap and trade, the auctions that come in every quarter. So part of the challenge of our funding is we have the Prop 1A funds of, again, $9 billion. We have the federal funds of $3.55 billion. But the challenge is the cap and trade, because that comes in on a quarterly basis, and we can't really predict what that dollar amount is. What I can say is we do track it very carefully, and it's actually coming in higher than what our highest projections are. So it is a forecast in our funding, and it is somewhat challenging.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make a comment that I think it's just convenient that the cost of this proposed interim segment is precisely equal to the amount of funding that you expect to have available to 2030. It's not taking any cost overruns into account, or the properties have not been purchased, right, or the right-of-ways haven't been secured. Is that correct?
So that is part of what we discussed about our contingency, and I don't want to get too technical on our 70, P70 and a P10, but the way I look at a P70 is we have a 70% chance of being accurate on our budget and a 30% chance of not being accurate. The way we got to our budget is to add about $990 million of contingency. The way I look at that is it's money set aside for those risks that we know we have mitigations for, but it might not work, or even those unknown risks that we're not aware of. But that's a big part. That's, of the 17% increase in the Central Valley, about 9% of that is just additional contingency funds to mitigate those risks that we're aware of or that we might not be aware of.
Okay. So I represent the 39th Assembly District, which the southern segment of the rail, the original vision, were to go through. And so can you please explain how this proposal benefits districts like mine or anything south of Bakersfield?
Sure. Well, this is the structure of statewide rail investment. It's always been acknowledged that it's not high-speed rail alone, because we have many areas where high-speed rail won't reach get to those cities. So I've always been looking at the idea of a statewide rail modernization approach, and that's been reflected in several ways in several new funding programs. Of course, the Cap and Trade program of 2014 set up a new funding program, and SB1 augmented that as well. So when we look across all of the different state funding sources, primarily the Cap and Trade and SB1, along with a little high-speed rail that's the bookend money, Southern California rail investments are about $4.4 billion. That we've seen over this past period since 2014. And that includes, again, some of the new SB1 money that's still coming in, but those are awarded projects to improve Metrolink, Surfliner, all those rail services. The Central Valley service, many travelers in the Central Valley will also choose to use the existing bus connection to get down to Los Angeles as well. So some of the travelers coming to and from Southern California would choose to use the Central Valley Rail, as they do today, but at much expanded numbers.
Do you have a projection on how those expanded numbers?
Yes.
How much does this reduce the trip time?
Sure. So those people that are riding rail today that pass through or within that Bakersfield to Merced segment would save 90 to 100 minutes of trip time. Mm-hmm. And the ridership numbers are in the early train operator report, which is on High Speed Rail's website, but at a high level, it about doubles the number of passengers looking across the three services. The Altamont Commuter Express, the San Joaquins would be operating as High Speed Rail, and then those bus connections from Bakersfield to Southern California.
But with the bus connections, are they really saving 90 to 100 minutes?
Well, again, for those existing passengers that would start in Southern California and want to take a rail trip to, say, Sacramento, currently there's, they could go the coastal rail route, and that takes, I think, about 11 hours to get from Los Angeles up to Sacramento. Slightly shorter if you take the bus connection from L.A. to Bakersfield and then get on the train at Bakersfield to go to Sacramento. So that particular Southern California traveler would see an increase, or a decrease rather, in trip time by that 90 to 100 minutes.
I noticed that your project update had no alternatives proposed. The only option that you're presenting is the Merced to Bakersfield. As a legislator, I would have liked to have seen various options, like the LAO mentioned. This is now something that the legislator has to consider, but I would like to have seen more options in your project update.
Sure, appreciate that. Yeah, again, the framing was commitments made at the time of the 2018 business plan to look at that valley to valley and look at the build out on either end of valley to valley and how we could do that interim service. Again, through our broader rail modernization efforts, we have done a lot of work on improvements in the Southern California area. There was over $1 billion provided for the, it's called the SCORE project that Metrolink's looking at for how to upgrade a number of lines, increase frequency to something like every 15 minutes on some of the most traveled lines down there. So there is work being done on those type of improvements as well. And again, they're not dependent on high-speed rail coming into those corridors, but they're mutual benefit projects that the LA Union Station, the Rosecrans Marquardt, when those free up more grade-separated segments, in some cases allow for a more continuous third track, those are all things that improve the existing rail services today.
There is no proposed stop in my district. The rail just goes right through it. And I'm not even sure my constituents would even be able to afford the high-speed rail if there were a stop in the district. And so that's what I think of when I see this project. I think of whether, people, my district is primarily low income, has currently no transit corridors, very little, and most people want transit within the area, within the region, to get to work, this affects their quality of life. But a project like this would disrupt, their lives, because we don't know yet, what homes will, which families will be displaced in the district. And so that's where, my concerns are, just for the overall vision of the project. But as far as this segment goes, I am also concerned the uncertainty of the federal government's involvement, which I think this project is highly dependent on, not just in the funding or the federal government as a funding source, but the NEPA reviews that you mentioned in your update originally are supposed to be conducted at the same time as the environmental impact reviews, right? And right now we don't know if that's going to happen, and if that doesn't happen concurrently, you won't make the December 2022 deadline. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. And for the environmental documents that are currently being updated, and there's two in the Central Valley. There's the Bakersfield area locally preferred alternative, and then there's the Y, which is in the Madera Merced area. So both of those currently, because of federal engagement, are going forward as CEQA first. So there's public hearings and public process on the CEQA side, but without the federal government engaging on the NEPA side, we're unable to go forward with those, and that does create a delay. We do need their re-engagement because we want to clear those segments and the other environmental documents through NEPA. That's the plan with the grant agreement. So the federal government is interested in holding us to the schedule, but we definitely need their engagement to review the NEPA documents or to go forth and do NEPA assignment, which is a process that the Department of Transportation has in California, where Caltrans is able to act as the federal NEPA lead and certify on their behalf, and that we've applied for that as well to the federal government for NEPA assignment for high-speed rail.
Yeah, I think with all of this uncertainty, not just in funding, but in like the NEPA engagement from the federal government, I don't think it's appropriate that we're still conducting the EIRs for the whole high-speed rail, including my district and the southern parts of the rail plan.
Well, I would just mention that as far as the benefit of doing the EIRs is it resolves some of those route issues, and of course through the environmental process, that's where you look at every opportunity to mitigate and reduce any unnecessary structure that's being taken, or try to work with communities to find the best alternative. So in going forward with those, I hope that provides more certainty on routes, and that provides some benefit. Also, doing the environmental work can help some other rail projects. We mentioned some of these shared corridors. So in some instances, if high-speed rail is able to clear something environmentally, that subset of that project may be able to go forward under that environmental approval for another project or a smaller subset project.
Okay, well, this is a huge infrastructure project, probably the largest in the country. And lots of uncertainty in funding, in federal engagement, which is necessary for this to even be a reality, even for the small segment that is being proposed today. And I think we should have other options for this, this project. And the history of it already, the last 10 years, has been lots of cost overruns. And each year, the public hears the increase in projected budget for the overall project. And I just don't see how we're going to get even our own state engaged in this huge infrastructure project and the will to fund it. So I look forward to more updates and more options for the legislature. Thank you.
Mr. Fong.
Thank you for being here. I've said before, the only predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So I just want to understand, I want everyone to understand what the original intent of Prop 1A was. So if the LAO can explain what the original Prop 1A design system was supposed to be.
Sure. So Prop 1A envisioned kind of two phases to the project. So phase one was to go from the San Francisco Bay Area down to Anaheim. Phase two was to extend further to Sacramento in the north and San Diego in the south. And so that was the general broad vision, and there was some additional specificity also laid out.
So fully electrified, completely separate line.
I believe it was intended to be. I don't know that it specifically called out whether it was to be fully separated or not, but certainly was the implication of building a rail line from those points. I don't think it was super specified in the measure.
Okay, so but at a minimum, we have a line that goes from San Francisco to Anaheim, electrified, separate or blended in some fashion, correct?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay, so I hear a lot of words like refocused, downsized, changed. So if the High-Speed Rail Authority can tell me, has the governor downsized this project? What is the position of the administration? Are we going to still do San Francisco and Anaheim as Prop 1A originally envisioned, or what is the project in its current form?
Sure. But what the governor's state of the state referred to, reorienting the project and looking at the money we had, and that's what we've done. So you might remember the prior business plan talked about things like extension of cap and trade to 2050, things like that. So this doesn't assume that. This just looks at the current money that's directed to high-speed rail. And what's cited as earlier mentioned is about $20.4 billion from the various sources, which are 1A, the cap and trade, and the federal funds already awarded to the project.
So I guess that's the confusion.
Yeah.
I sat and listened to the state of the state.
Right.
And all the reports afterwards was that the governor downsized the project. So has the governor downsized the project?
Well, no, but we're recognizing the building block approach. These are the monies we have. This is what we can get done with the money we have. In getting this done, and I think this gets to this issue that Assemblymember Patterson raised of credibility. We need to deliver those capital projects on the ground. And having delivered that, having demonstrating high-speed rail service by getting the train sets, getting that up and operating, that is the first building block. And think that focus on delivery, focus on building what we can with the existing money, that's the first important step. And then ultimately, yes, that extension to the Bay Area, that extension to Southern California, that's still part of the vision. But we don't have a funding path right now to get there. But in getting this first building block, we're advancing the system, and I believe that at some point the federal government will re-engage because high-speed rail around the country, there's increasing interest. Other states are looking at this well. So I do believe at some point the federal government will re-engage.
So let's focus on the funding.
Sure.
As my colleague mentioned before, you have no margin of error. I mean, I get the contingency argument, but your cost for the Central Valley is 20.4, and you've identified $20.4 billion. And we all know what happens when you assume, right? So on page 32, you've indicated that the ongoing construction of Madera and Wasco has increased $1.8 billion. That's correct. And then, yes, the project in Central Valley has gone up $1.8 billion.
Yes, including the contingency, but yeah, the baseline cost is up $1.8 billion.
So that's the baseline cost. What is the higher range cost? It's a little higher, right? It's 13 billion?
So the 13.7 billion, that also represents the cost for the Central Valley, but also the bookends investments.
So just to be accurate, we got a range, right? As you indicated, a contingency. So the cost could be 12.4 billion, or it could be 13.7 billion.
No, if I said something earlier, I apologize. The ranges are from the funding. The funding range is anywhere from 20.45 billion to $23.44 billion. That's the range for the potential funding, mainly due to the cap and trade, because that fluctuates. The cost for the Central Valley did go from 10.6 to 12.4. That's the $1.8 billion. That's about a 17% increase. And again, of that 17%, about 10% of that, 9% of that is this contingency that we've been talking about.
But the previous year, the cost segment went up $2.8 billion.
From the 16, 18, yeah, I believe that's correct.
Right. So we are now seeing a pattern. You didn't do a cost estimate at the beginning of 2012, right? And then now it was 10 billion, and now it's 12 billion.
Right. What I would explain that $1.8 billion increase, or the 17% increase, is, again, you have about 9% contingency. I would say you have about $360 million of that is scope change. So we added scope to the project, which is the additional cost, and about $477 million is what I would call cost increases, because we know more about how much something's going to cost.
Sure. But you can't guarantee that there won't be another cost overrun.
No one can guarantee if there won't be a cost. You're correct.
Right.
But that's part of the benefit of having a contingency.
So the likelihood of a cost overrun is pretty certain.
There's always,
if I outline what Assemblymember Rivas has indicated, if the NEPA review isn't completed, if the feds don't re-engage, if the right-of-way acquisition goes up, if there's lawsuits that say that you no longer abide by Prop 1A, that delays the project. That also increases costs, correct?
those would be risks, yes, that
right, and those are all assumptions built into this system, into this report, which is why the LAO has indicated that this report is highly dependent on the assumptions being made. And the assumptions being made is very, very concerning, correct?
The assumptions being made are the risks that we can identify, and yes, the FRA engagement is a critical piece of this project. We did factor in that piece, and all the other risks, again, which is why we increased, again, we went from a P10 from the 2018 business plan to a P70 number to address those risks that we're talking about.
So then, if you don't mind me asking, why didn't you do a P70 or higher on the full alignment?
The way I look at it is, the more this project goes on, the more we know. Utility cost, right-of-way cost, we learn from those things. And so I would say earlier on in the project, it would be difficult to come up with a P70. But I think we feel pretty comfortable now, at least in the Central Valley piece, that a P70 number is pretty accurate, which again, which is the $1.8 billion increase.
So you're saying that you can't do a P70 for the full alignment, or the full alignment, if we're now stipulating that the project hasn't changed?
Well, we're bound by the next 2020 business plan. We will have to do another estimate on what the valley to valley is going to cost, and actually what phase 1 is going to cost. So that will be included in that report. But today we don't have that.
Yeah, but that's in 2020. We're making decisions today.
Correct.
So why wasn't there a decision to be made that maybe provides some additional information of why on the full alignment?
To do a P70 or any type of estimate for the valley to valley or the phase 1 is going to take some time. Again, this project update report focused on the Central Valley and what we're currently doing today. But it is a requirement in the 2020 business plan, and it will be there, but we don't have that information today.
So you don't have the information to do a cost assessment for the full alignment?
We don't have the analysis done to be able to come up with that number today.
And so we have to wait till 2020 to get that?
Yes.
Now, in terms of what Assemblymember Patterson alluded to, can you explain to me what regional intercity service is? You alluded to it on page 64. So you're now doing regional intercity service on this alignment.
Sure. Well, what's proposed is, again, that 171-mile high-speed rail segment that's fully integrated with the other rail and in the south bus connecting service. So that would be described in the plan as the would describing the connections of the rail. Is that what you're looking for?
I'm just trying to understand what that means. Are we just running trains, diesel trains or Amtrak trains connecting the cities? Or I'm just trying to understand what you're describing when you say in regional intercity service is going to be used.
Sure. So a passenger going, say, from Bakersfield to Merced would get on a high-speed rail train, and that trip from Bakersfield to Merced would take something like an hour and 20 minutes. For passengers that are continuing further north, perhaps to Sacramento, in Merced, they would be able to board either San Joaquin or ACE train and continue that trip further north, again, either to Sacramento or into the Bay Area as well through the ACE and the San Joaquin connection.
So you're saying that in 2027, 2028, that's going to happen. But in the meantime, what does that look like?
Sure. Well, in the meantime, we're continuing to build the system. We're continuing to expand south to Bakersfield. Again, by the end of 2027, that's when the Bakersfield extension is planned to be completed, and the high-speed rail trains would initially...
So you're telling me at no time is there going to be conventional rail being used on this alignment?
That's correct.
So it's going to be high speed from the very beginning?
That's what correct. Looking at building on to Bakersfield, building on to Merced, and having the train service be the electrified rail service.
So I don't think you're getting to Bakersfield, but from Poplar Avenue to Merced, it's high-speed rail.
Well, this wouldn't initiate the high-speed rail until those extension to Bakersfield occurs. Again, this would go from Madera to Bakersfield as the first rail service on the new systems, and that initiate by the end of 2027.
So when I read in the report, you say that you have interim service. So interim service is passenger trains, but not high speed, or are they high speed?
Now, for that segment, Madera to Bakersfield high-speed trains,
And how fast are they going to go?
well, they would be able to go at the up to 200 miles an hour at that highest speed.
Okay, so you're going to guarantee that it goes 200 miles an hour from Bakersfield to Madera?
Yeah, because again, we're building the alignment that's consistent with the Prop 1A requirements on speed. So yeah, the system's being built for that speed, and the trains will be acquired to meet those specifications.
So where did this notion come that slow trains are going to be put on this track?
Well, again, what's proposed is fast trains, so I'm not sure. With, as I mentioned, with the Federal Railroad Administration over time, they've asked for different plans for early use of the system, but we've talked about wanting to do electrified service and go directly to that, not the diesel trains in the interim. So that's what has been discussed with FRA in in the prior years' discussion of early operation of the segment.
So let me read on page 9. It says, as part of the phased implementation, the assets built in the Central Valley could be used by an interim passenger train operator until additional funding became available. This approach was memorialized in the federal grant agreements. Specifically, the diesel San Joaquin intercity passenger trains, which operate on shared freight rail tracks, could be shifted to the high-speed rail tracks to realize a reduced passenger train travel time in the Central Valley.
Correct. And I think that's associated with the
2020.
Correct. Well, that diesel use has been discussed with the federal government as an interim use option, but what is currently being proposed, and including to the federal government, is the electrified rail.
So then let me follow up on page 10, which is, however, the 2018 business plan indicated that there was not sufficient funding to complete the valley-to-valley line with the current available and committed funding. Therefore, the authority stated its intent to seek the support of the ETO in evaluating the potential for an interim service in the Central Valley to provide early benefits.
Correct. And that interim service is the electrified service.
Okay. So then on page 15, you indicated a $62.6 million shortfall even if we ran this interim service. And then on Exhibit 1.2, it's potentially 82.8 if you don't do it. Right? If I'm the fare box revenue?
Sure, and what that's indicating, and this is in the ETO analysis, is looking at the combined service in the Central Valley, which is ACE and San Joaquin, and the interim use high-speed rail segment, and indicating without high-speed rail, there's a operating support of about $83 million. With high-speed rail, because of the increase in ridership, the increase in fare box recovery, that operating support actually falls by $20 million to about $63 million.
So you got a $62.6 million shortfall.
Well, I don't believe it's a shortfall. Currently, ACE and the San Joaquins receive operating support, as do the commuter rail and other intercity rail providers.
Right, but it doesn't cover the cost. Right, I'm looking at your report. It doesn't cover the cost. Cost is $228.4 million, and the revenues is $165.8 million. You have an arrow showing a shortfall. How do you make up that shortfall?
Well, that is the operating support, again, that falls with the advent of high-speed rail relative to Exhibit 1.2 on the right.
Right. So, no, I agree with, I'm with you. The shortfall drops from $82.8 million to $62.6 million. Okay. So you still got a $62.8 million shortfall.
Well, I don't believe it's fair to call it a shortfall. So these are, as I mentioned, with commuter rail, with intercity rail, those are services that today receive operating support. So fare box recovery doesn't fund 100% of the operation.
So operating support comes from where?
Well, in the case of intercity rail, the state provides funding.
So the state makes up the shortfall?
That's correct.
Wait, the difference between cost and revenue is a shortfall, correct? I'm using the
But
language in your
terms of-
report.
Sure, I'm just, in terms of, what the baseline funding is what I'm getting at, that we fund these services today, these intercity rail services, and there's other sources of funding as well for commuter rail services, so those are existing funding mechanisms for these.
So I think we're saying, I think you're trying to try to not really answer the question, but let me read from the rebuttal from Prop 1A on the ballot, which is, it's simple and fair. Once completed, the users of the system pay for the system, right? So there's no subsidy, there's no state funding in addition to making up the shortfall. I mean, this is what Assemblyman Patterson is alluding to, right? Which is who pays for the shortfall? Does the state have to come in and subsidize and backfill the difference between the cost and the revenues of the system?
Well, again, I think we're generally in agreement on these factual issues, that for the full non-subsidized, with the high-speed rail linking, high-speed rail provided service, that is looking at a longer segment that would get Valley to Valley, San Jose to Bakersfield, say that's the segment where you'd have the ridership revenue fully funding the operations. Again, these interim service opportunities, be it Caltrain, be it Central Valley service, these are services where there is operating support currently, and that would continue with the interim service.
Let me ask the question a different way. Does the Central Valley portion pay for itself?
In terms of operations?
In terms of everything?
Well, there would be ongoing operating support for the three segments that are operating the system together. Again, the
paid for by who?
The state would be part of that.
The state would pay for it.
We are today.
So that is not. So what was in the ballot argument is not true. The users of the system pay for the system. You're telling me now that the state's going to have to offset some of the costs?
Well, again, this is the distinction between who's providing the service. It would not be directly high-speed rail providing the service. It would be one of these other rail providers. Again, it is done in Southern California and Los Angeles with the bookend investments.
So my last question is this, and I appreciate the chairman's patience. So in this our news article, I think off the NBC story, I want to read this quote, and I want to get your answer or your perspective. Lou Thompson serves on an independent peer review group that oversees the high-speed rail project for the governor and legislature. Thompson told NBC Bay Area he believes the entire project is in crisis. Quote, "The truth is that the pace of construction really will have to pick up rapidly if in fact it's going to be finished before the 2022 deadline," Thompson said. Can this be done? We need to ask the authority, and we need to make them make a full, solid, enforceable commitment about what they can do. Thompson believes that the only way the project can continue as designed is for the state to raise taxes and drastically increase construction. Do you agree with that statement?
Well, I agree that we need to accelerate our delivery in the Central Valley, so I agree with that 100%.
So that's not a hard no. Is it a maybe?
Well, again, I'm agreeing with the statement we need to accelerate our construction.
So the statement I'm asking is that Thompson believes the only way the project can continue as designed is for the state to raise more taxes and drastically increase construction.
Right.
Is that something that the authority and the administration is considering?
Again, not on the, we're looking at the money we have and delivering a high-speed rail segment with the money we have and foresee to have in the future. We're not looking at increasing taxes or anything like that. The idea is to get the delivery done, get the high-speed rail trains up and operating, and then, yes, I believe, look for that federal partnership to resume. Sure. That would include additional funding in the future as well.
So I'll just end with this statement. The quote is, we need to have the authority make a full, solid, enforceable commitment, and I don't hear a full, solid, enforceable commitment. The assumptions made in this report are difficult to accept because they don't. The report isn't in reality, right? So the costs are going to be higher. The margins you have no margin. the cap-and-trade funding goes down over time if cap-and-trade is going to succeed. And that has been accepted by everyone, even those who design cap-and-trade. NEPA's unclear whether you can get NEPA approval from the federal government. The federal government hasn't engaged. Secret reviews are going forward. Lawsuits are going forward. What was told to the voters in 2008 and what the design of this project is now is not the same. It is not the same. No one can tell me that what was told to the voters in 2008 and what that segment was supposed to be from the Bay Area to Anaheim, that this report does not outline that. And so I can wait till 2020 for you to tell me what this new alignment is going to be and whether we have environmental clearance or not. But we're going to wait 2020, and we're going to spend, you guys are going to spend a whole lot more taxpayer dollars. So I would hope that at some point you can give me a full analysis of what this entire project is going to look like and give me some ranges. But right now, if I accept the LAO analysis, which is true, all 6 of her assumptions are her concerns are true. You refocus the project, which is not what was promised to the voters. Actual costs can be higher. They will be higher. We have a 70% chance of success and a 30% chance of failure. There's uncertainty with cap-and-trade. There's no funding outlined in detail from Merced to Bakersfield. And the legislature now has to reassess this project at a time when you're not giving us any information until next year. And so this is really troubling to me. And at this point in time, this project's got to stop. And if you want to see, Assemblymember Rivas, what it's going to look like to your community, I would suggest that you talk to Assemblymember Patterson, because that's what's happening in Fresno right now.
Mr. Mullen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Annis, for your good work on a complex project and for answering the questions today. I joined the conversation midstream here on the dais, so my apologies if you've touched on this. But there are multiple references to, under the early interim service scenario, that the service is contingent on a highly integrated rail service from Sacramento, Oakland, and San Jose into the Bay Area. Do you anticipate any delay, specifically with the bookend projects serving the job centers to the north and south under this scenario? Do you expect delay?
No, and as you know, Caltrain is moving forward with construction, and the rail cars, I believe, are being built already as well in Utah. So that project is cleared environmental. All the funding agreements have been signed. Money is being reimbursed to Caltrans from the high-speed rail project, so that 50-mile segment being electrified on the peninsula is going forward, and there's nothing in here that would change that. I will mention in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Union Station project is also having some challenges with NEPA. They're going forward with a CEQA first strategy as well at this period of time. But again, as far as the high-speed rail funding, there's nothing in here that would change that commitment. We're still very much supportive of that project and want to be a funding partner for that project.
Right. So you've talked about NEPA and a tenuous relationship, to put it nicely, with the federal government in 2019. Do you expect the bookend project specifically, you talked about NEPA, I think you said NEPA first, is that right? So are there additional federal environmental approvals that are still needed, outstanding approvals for the 2 bookend projects?
For the LA Union Station,
LA
yes,
only.
But I believe Caltrain is all environmentally cleared with the federal government.
Okay. And I would just conclude, this relationship with the federal government. Over the time horizon of this project, we're going to see multiple administrations probably, with perhaps a very different view. In fact, the current administration is talking about a $2 trillion infrastructure project. Infrastructure nationally is going to get additional attention by multiple administrations moving forward. So we're looking at this in a 2019 context. But this is a longitudinal project of massive scale. And I anticipate at some point the federal government will be a full partner in this, and we need that. We do. But looking at 2019 sort of configuration and extrapolating that out well into the future, I think is a little bit of folly. But I share the anxiety about the current relationship. But I thank you for your leadership on a very, very difficult topic, Mr. Chair.
Just to be clear, and I think we'll take public comment on this item before we move on to issue 4, since we've already spent so much time on this item. We should isolate the public comment too, I think. But I wanted to be clear in understanding the role of the federal government currently. Is it correct that we're being asked to demonstrate that the project can move forward expeditiously by the federal government?
Correct. Yeah, they sent a letter, of course, indicating concern on the schedule. High-speed rail responded, indicating we're compliant with the grant agreement and still able to meet the 2022 deadlines for the schedule. So again, the federal government is a partner in achieving some of those deliverables, such as the federal NEPA review and approval.
And yet, it's also my understanding that the federal government now is essentially refusing to engage on moving the project forward. Would that be an accurate statement?
That's correct. Yeah, they've been pencils down on the NEPA work, I believe, since last August. And since the letters came out, they haven't met with high-speed rail.
Well, I think that speaks for itself. Let's take public comment now. Are there any members of the public who'd like to be heard on this item? Issue 3.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Member Steve Baker with Aaron Reed & Associates for the Professional Engineers in California Government. This committee for several years, going on 10 years now, has heard about these cost increases that you've all been discussing. In addition to the NBC investigation, the LA Times also recently completed their own investigation of high-speed rail, and what they found was that one of the largest reasons for these cost increases is because of the over-reliance or almost complete reliance on private sector engineering consultants to run the project. They have private sector consultants hiring private sector consultants to oversee private sector consultants being inspected by private sector consultants, all at a cost of 2 or 3 times the cost of what a state-employed engineer would be. We think that the committee should find a way of having the agency staff up over the longer term so that you can reduce your costs and gain control of the project and reduce these costs and going forward. We don't think you should wait for a future budget year. The High-Speed Rail Authority should start hiring design engineers and construction inspection engineers to save costs on the project. Thank you.
Good morning, Chair Bloom and members. My name is Roland Brand. I come from San Jose. I have no affiliation. I'd like to very briefly touch on the alignment and the decision to start operation in Central Valley. Starting with the alignment, there is absolutely no way that an alignment between Merced and Bakersfield will ever be competitive with air travel between LA and San Francisco. So I urge you to hold any further funding for this project until the authority terminates all contracts south of Fresno and starts environmental clearance on a direct connection between Giro and Fresno that requires little to no tunneling. With regards to operations, the business case for starting operation in Central Valley is based on incorrect data provided by the authority to the early train operator, including inflated ridership figures in Central Valley, low ridership estimates, and inflated cost of operations in the peninsula. And last but not least, there is no mention in the reports of emerging private sector interest in operating a high-speed service between San Francisco and Gilroy and potentially Hollister? Thank you.
So let me close this item out with a couple of comments, and thank you, Mr. Annis and your team, for providing us with an update here today. It is just an update. It's one stop along the way. This, in my view, the high-speed rail project remains not just one of California's most important infrastructure projects, but one of the country's most important infrastructure projects. We are one of the few industrialized nations in the world that today do not have high-speed rail. Now, is that in and of itself a reason why we have to have it here? No. But there are compelling reasons why high-speed rail is important to California and to the country. Those have all been discussed in the past. The voters actually weighed in on this, although it was some time ago, but they provided the seed money for the project. Opposition to this project has been, it's a big project. It generates opposition. I get that. But whether it was a proposal for the full length of the system, the same folks were in opposition who are in opposition today, and now that I think a more realistic proposal is being made in response to those who said and complained, there's no money to build out the entire system. We should be focused on what we actually can do. And now we have an update that tries to do exactly that. And the same critics are all over the project saying, well, that's outrageous, and you're not providing the information that you're supposed to be providing, and all the other arguments that we hear. And I respect the fact that there are concerns about this project, partly because it's so big and partly because it takes a long time under any scenario to build out a project of this length, and there are also a number of uncertainties which come along with any public works project of this magnitude. We need to work through those issues step by step and stage by stage, and I think that the governor is trying to do that now and take a more realistic view of what we can do in the near term, understanding that there are additional steps and that the full build-out of this project is essential and needs to follow along with what's being proposed in the update. I don't think, and this is true in every district in the state. I think this is a project that people look at and kind of scratch their heads and think, is it realistic? Is it not? Could this money be better spent in other ways? There are a lot of legitimate conversations around this, but the project itself, the need for high-speed rail as a environmentally favorable project, as a relief valve for our beleaguered air transportation system. Folks, our airports, I know most of you who are here and who are listening to this hearing today travel by air from place to place in California. Our airports are near maxed out, and we need to be thinking long-term for the future of the state of California. Air travel is also uses a lot of fossil fuels, and we're able, through high-speed rail, to shift into a more sustainable system. There are a myriad of other reasons why this project is important, and I think the debate is going to continue. I respect you, Mr. Annis, for stepping into this role, coming here today, and suffering the slings and arrows, which this is our responsibility to provide that oversight. But you're here, you're still standing, the project is still standing, and I expect that it's going to continue, and we're going to continue to provide the oversight and demand the answers from you that help make this a long-term project that is maximally successful for the people of the state of California.
Well, thank you for those comments.
You're welcome, and with that, we'll move on to issue 4.